One. Hey, everybody. It's 10:15. Thank you for joining us. I don't believe there's a moderator for this session, so I will serve as my own moderator. My name is Brian Cochran. I'm with Spectrum Environmental Solutions, the director of the Installed Systems Group with Spectrum. And today I'm going to be talking about Fenceline and community air monitoring. The title, in hindsight, I think I would change it, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Little background before I get started, just on our company and my background as well. Spectrum was founded 4 years ago. We have a lot of legacy employees from companies such as IMAC, Sage, URS, and AECOM. We build and use optical measurement devices for both environmental and process engineering applications. We have extractive and open path devices that we use. I joined Spectrum 2 years ago. Prior to that, I spent 18 years with URS and AECOM with their ambient air monitoring group here in Austin, and came into Spectrum and took over as director of their installed systems group. That is, so for applications where our devices are used in kind of longer term applications, such as Fenceline monitoring, those are projects that I help oversee. We are 19 employees strong. The majority of us are here in Austin. We also have a contingent in Atlanta and employees in Houston, Denver, Portland, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. I said an EPA priority is how I kind of used in the title. It probably would have been more appropriate to say an environmental justice priority. And so as part of my introduction, I kind of want to talk about how Fenceline monitoring has been kind of portrayed more in recent history in the news. It's become kind of a political issue, whereas I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't in the public consciousness or political consciousness quite as much. And then talk about how that kind of relates to the evolution of different Fenceline monitoring rules and laws over the past 6 years or so, and go through that. A lot of that isn't happening in California, and in Colorado, there's been some very interesting developments, and so I'll be talking about that as well. And given the evolution of what Fenceline programs have now become, wanted to talk about, in my opinion, what are the key elements to a successful Fenceline air monitoring program. They've really grown in complexity, I feel, over the past, half a decade. And a big part of that reason why they've grown in complexity, in my opinion, is because of the influence of affected communities around Fenceline, our industrial facilities, and the environmental justice movement. So this seems like a long time ago, but it was only October. And I don't know if you people in here watched the debates, but my ears kind of perked up when I heard the word Fenceline. And what Joe Biden said there is basically that, protecting Fenceline communities and, imposing restrictions on polluters was going to be one of the priorities of this administration. And that has borne out. Earlier this year, EPA released what some people refer to as their EJ memo, talking about what some of the priorities of the agency were going to be. And EJ was a big one of them. And the use of Fenceline monitoring and other kind of next-gen compliance enforcement tools was a big part of that. Now, this is nothing new. It had been part of the previous administration's agenda. It went away for 4 years, but it's now back. And so the use of supplemental environmental projects is also back. And one of the SEPs that they highlight, one of the examples they frequently give, are Fenceline monitoring programs. Like I said, this is a change. It was only a year ago that the Department of Justice ended the longstanding practice of including SEPs as a part of legal settlements with EPA. So last summer was an active time for social movements in the aftermath of the George Floyd incident, and environmental justice also kind of peaked along with this. And so this is an article from CNN talking about just that. And so I think, as we said, as we talk about what the future of Fenceline monitoring holds, need to be cognizant of this movement because it's really helping drive things. So keeping that in mind, and this will kind of frame the rest of our presentation here today, I wanted to talk about some of the recent Fenceline monitoring rules, starting with EPA's Fenceline monitoring rule, which I think most people, when you talk about Fenceline monitoring, that's where their head goes, but then also talk about some of the more state level things in California and Colorado. So Refinery MACT required Fenceline monitoring for petroleum refineries. I think that was promulgated December 1st, 2015. And it's called Fenceline monitoring, but it utilizes passive sampling tubes. These samples are deployed over 2-week periods and then sent offsite to a laboratory where they're analyzed for benzene using method EPA 325B. So the results aren't available for several weeks, and they're not available to the public usually for months after the fact. So I guess my question is this really a monitoring program? I think it's really a sampling program. So I'd like to keep those two words separate. You know, a monitor gives results in somewhat near time. And I think when you ask the public or the affected communities around industrial facilities what they want in a monitoring program, the expectation is that a monitor gives real-time data. A sampling program doesn't. Shortly after that, in 2016, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District in California came up with their own rule, and this was in response to a fire at the Chevron facility there in 2012, and they commissioned an expert panel to look at the range of available technologies for air monitoring to come up with, well, what would be the best technology to use? And that expert panel arrived at open path Fenceline monitoring. And so that was adopted on April 26th of 2016, and it affected 5 refineries in the Bay Area. So not long after that, California as a whole, the assembly there passed a law that said, okay, well, this type of refinery Fenceline monitoring needs to be done all across the state. And it put into the law that this monitoring needed to be real time. So a change from the EPA sampling kind of protocol. And it also required the data from these programs be provided as quickly as possible in a publicly accessible format. Also, a difference between the EPA program and this. In California, it's divided into several different air quality districts. It basically gave the districts authority to come up with their own programs, and required that the guidance for those programs incorporate input from affected parties. So they're not driving the rules, but their input needs to be considered. Well, as that was happening at the state level, the South Coast Air Quality Management District had already kind of moved ahead. So you can see in terms of dates, this is October of 2017. South Coast had their rule ready months later. And so it wasn't in response to the state law, but kind of in parallel. And they, similar to the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, called for the use of open path monitoring. And they, it's interesting in the guidance document, they state why it is. And they said that open path monitoring, quote, conventional Fenceline air monitoring techniques rely on point monitors that greatly increase the chances of missing surface emissions, hotspots, or emission plumes. And that's something that you'll hear a lot from affected communities as a criticism of point monitoring along the fence line, is that there's this idea that the pollution is basically, those plumes are going between the point sources. And so rightly or wrongly, there's a perception, I think, within those groups that OpenPath provides a more comprehensive view of pollution along the fence line. Some other interesting parts about elements of the South Coast Rule 1180. It required a notification system for communities near the refineries when emissions exceeded certain threshold levels. And one overlooked aspect of this program, but if you're implementing and managing one of these programs, you don't overlook it, is the fact that you need to make a phone call to the executive director at 1-800-CUT-SMOG anytime within 2 hours of discovering that your equipment has failed to accurately provide real-time air monitoring information. So if you're, like I said, if you're operating one of these programs, that's a real motivator right there to try and find ways not to have downtime. And so I'll be talking a little bit later about some things that we've done to try and avoid having to make that phone call, because it's not something that's real fun. One of the other interesting elements of Rule 1180 is, the real expansion of the list of compounds that are being monitored for. The EPA Fenceline monitoring rule, we're just looking at benzene. South Coast rule, you're looking at 20 different compounds. All but 2 of those compounds are ideal candidates for measurement by OpenPath technologies. The only 2 compounds that that aren't suitable for that are H2S and black carbon. And so those are generally monitored for by using point monitors. So that brings us to more or less current day. This is a signing ceremony with the governor of Colorado that took place just less than 2 months ago, signing into law Colorado House Bill 211189. Similar to some of the California rules, specifically Rule 1180 in a lot of ways, but the way it evolved is notably different, I would say. Whereas in California, you have different parties that are involved in these sort of decisions. You have industry, you have legislators, you have regulators, and then you have the community. I'd say in California, the process started more with legislators and regulators, and then the community was allowed to have some input. In Colorado, the order of things kind of got flipped a little bit. The community was really in on the front end for this. They were driving what this law included. The regulators kind of got brought in at the very end, and they were allowed to have a little bit of input. So really flipped the script, and it's created for a really interesting law. It targets 3 compounds specifically: benzene, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen cyanide, but then leaves the door open to potentially measuring more things later. We'll let you know what we think about that. And it applies to 3 different areas of industry: petroleum refineries, petroleum bulk terminals, and aircraft parts and manufacturing. And then they also say in the law, and we may decide to target other industries in the future, we'll let you know. So this is going to be something that I expect, if we do the same presentation next year, there's going to be a whole lot more to talk about in Colorado. Also similar to the California rules is stated preference in the Colorado House bill to use OpenPath monitoring technologies, or as they say it in the law, optical remote sensing technologies. Like California, public notifications and a public website are required. Unlike California, the way that those public notifications are being sent out is very interesting. So in California, if you want to receive notifications about the concentration exceedances at the refinery, you would go to the refinery Fenceline monitoring website, sign up for the alerts, and then you would then receive them. In Colorado, they're going to be using, and the law states this, the public emergency management system, I think is the words more or less, but basically reverse 911. So in the same way that you would get an alert on your phone that told you about an Amber Alert or local flooding, that's how you will get a notification about an exceedance at the refinery. So it's not something you opt into. It's something that you will just receive. So avoiding false positives, false alerts, something I'll talk more about later, because as critical as it is when you're dealing with a list of people that want to receive these, imagine people getting this on their phone when they don't even want it to begin with. Lastly, this is supposed to be online by January 1st, 2023. That heavy sigh is from George Lipinski, president of Spectrum Environmental Solutions. This is an extremely ambitious timeline and in way less time that was allowed for in California. This is another instance where I think where you can look at, in California, where you had a rule that was influenced by, regulators and industry. Here in Colorado, I think the public said, no, we want this as soon as possible. And so we'll see. So you can see with that evolution that I've shown there, like, the number of compounds we're looking at is getting increasing. The types of technology that are getting used are more complex. Everything about these Fenceline monitoring programs is getting more difficult. And so there are a lot of elements that go into what I'll call a modern day Fenceline monitoring program if you want it to be successful. And so this is kind of a list that if I were evaluating contractors for a job to execute this work, this would be my job interview question list. Tell me about the equipment that you're going to use. Who makes that equipment? Some of these facilities, if you want to get equipment, they'll ask you to prepare a bid spec, and then they're going to put that bid spec out, and they're going to want at least 3 quotes to come in, and maybe they go with, just the lowest cost person. Well, what if that lowest cost person is a gigantic international company that when you call their service department, you never get anyone on the phone? Those are considerations. Software. And this is really more applicable to the open path world than to, say, some other kind of more conventional point monitoring systems. But with spectroscopy, your detection limits are really software based. And so what type of software are you going to use? On-site operations and maintenance. If you're going to have to make a call to the agency, and luckily Colorado doesn't have this yet, every time that you fail to accurately provide real-time information, you want to get out there and solve things quickly. So who do you have on site that can get out there? Are they available on the weekends? What about off-site staff? One of the things that's very different about Fenceline monitoring programs now than, say, 10, 20 years ago is there are so many things that can be done remotely. And so the person that you have out there as your local person doesn't need to be the most experienced person on your team. If you have offsite personnel with a ton of experience that can back them up, they can be their, if the onsite person can kind of be your eyes and ears and let the offsite people, the offsite experts know what's going on, you can resolve a lot of issues that way. Robust QA/QC procedures. In California, for those of us who prepared quality assurance project plans to be reviewed by the South Coast Air Quality Management District, we've been trying to get those approved for over 2 years. Your ability to generate a craft that will be accepted by them and having robust procedures, SOPs, it's also important. Validating air quality data, analyzing it, being able to pull out trends and provide information to, say, your client that maybe the rule doesn't require, but that you can find something else for them. Experience running similar programs. And lastly, and this is the part I think that has changed the most or evolved the most, is data management. What is your data platform? Is it specifically designed for air quality monitoring data? How customizable is your data platform to meet different needs? How quickly can you adjust? What do your websites look like? How does your automated notification system work? And so I think what I'd like to discuss with The remaining time is kind of focused more on the data management side of things. And this is where I think we've evolved the most. Talk about the key elements of a quality data management dissemination system, your ability to process data in real time, your ability to give different user experiences depending upon who it is that's viewing the website. The public may, is going to be able to view one thing on some of these websites, but the client wants to view something else. And there may be even different levels of client privileges depending upon who it is that's logging in. Already mentioned, the importance of real-time alerting and QA/QC, handling different payloads from different instrumentation. On the right-hand side here is just one 5-minute FTIR data payload from one of our systems, over 9,000 characters. So we're pulling this in from 12 different OpenPath systems every 5 minutes. A lot of data. Speaking of that, pulling in a lot of data, storing data is easy, right? What are you going to do with it? So this is an example of just how much data we're pulling in at one of our Fenceline monitoring programs in California at the Torrance Refinery. We're operating on 12 different measurement paths, 6 stations. So we have 6 OpenPath FTIR analyzers, 6 UV DOAS analyzers, 6 H2S, 6 black carbon point analyzers. Do the math on it. Each quarter, we're collecting over 4 million hourly concentration measurements. So that's just concentration data. Well, we're also collecting 5-minute concentration data. Well, we're also collecting diagnostic information from all these instruments. So we're storing a ton of data, which means nothing unless you're going to do something with it. And so that's where we've been focusing a lot of our effort, is how to make all this data work for us. How do we use that data to identify problems quickly in a way that we're not overwhelming people? And dashboards are nothing new, but we've customized a lot of dashboards for our Fenceline monitoring applications to be able to do just that, using simple kind of logic rules. Green means good, yellow means warning, red, we have a problem. And then each hour, the dashboard will run a report. If there's any red on that dashboard, we're sending a notification to people to say there's something to look at. Now, there's too much information to put on one dashboard, so this is just a main dashboard. If there's something wrong, we'll then drill down on that dashboard. This is the OpenPath specific dashboard. So this is nothing new, but it's critical if you're going to try and keep tabs on all the data that you're pulling in and make use of that diagnostic information. One of the areas where I think we've made, I'm proud of the advancements that we made, is taking internal notification data and automating actions in response to that. Like I said, the big driver for this was the fact that I don't want to have to call 1-800-CUT-SMOG on Saturday morning at 8 a.m. when I wake up and realize something's down. If we can get that fixed overnight automatically and keep it to minimal downtime, that's what I want to happen. And so, a lot of our communication on our project has switched away from kind of traditional methods of electronic communication like email, and we've gone to using Slack, which has really been so helpful in terms of collaboration on things, but also getting automated notifications sent to that so that people can respond. So this is just an example of how we had a computer go offline at 1:30 a.m. and I think this is actually a weekend. Our database detected that with a downtime alert. Our database then powered the cycle to the site. By 1:41, get another log me in alert to let us know that the computer's back online. And so total downtime was 9 minutes. That little heart emoji icon there was a comment left by our field operator, who's appreciating the fact that he doesn't have to call the district to notify them of downtime. Our systems at Torrance Refinery, our OpenPath systems, utilize a Moog auto tracker that will aim our instrument from one path to the other. Moogs are inherently problematic. And so one of the pieces of information that we store from those trackers is where it's aiming. And when it's not aiming at the right correction, we get, or the right direction, I should say, we get a notification. Sometimes we can remotely solve those issues, sometimes we can't, but we're getting notified of them right away. And in this case, we were able to get it resolved within a sufficient amount of time to where we didn't need to make a notification on it. Yet another example. We have a computer, or we lost data connection to a site. We have a watchdog application that runs on the computer that identified that the FTIR hadn't collected the spectra in the last 20 minutes, sends us a screenshot of what's on the computer screen before it reboots so that we kind of know, or when we go to try and troubleshoot it later, get a better idea of like just what was happening. Computer comes back online, we're down for about 30 minutes. So these are things that even, when this program started in early January 1st, 2020, we weren't doing these things. We've developed them, as this program has evolved. So we talked earlier about how Colorado's notification system is going to work with reverse 911, and I'm good at coming up with these kind of nascent ideas and then try and throw them at smart people and say, can you make this happen? And I had this idea for a kill switch. I said, what if we put in a 10-minute buffer between we actually measure concentration exceedance and that notification goes out? Can I get a text notification? Gives us a little time to review it, particularly if it's during working hours. And if I don't like what I see, respond kill. And I said, well, that's interesting. We have that working. So this is an example of a text notification that I received at 12:19. Said warning's about to be sent. It gave us enough time to kind of all look at the spectroscopy for that event, realize, okay, no, there was a problem here. Kill the event. You can see the text message indicates that, and this is what it shows up in our operations log. So it's all documented. Most of the time it doesn't come to this, but if it does, it's nice to have kind of a last resort. So coming back to our list, like I said, if you're a facility that needs to be doing this sort of thing, this is kind of my interview list. And for what it's worth, we do every single one of the things on this list. If you're dealing with someone that doesn't, and they're going to be forming a team, you'll probably want to talk to each of the members about the team to see how they do those things. So with that, I'll conclude. I think it's safe to say that affected communities and the environmental justice movement are becoming increasingly involved in the development and not just providing input to Fenceline and community air monitoring rules and regulations. And as a result, they're becoming more complex. They're asking more. They're looking for expanded target lists. They're looking for real-time measurements, real-time reporting, and real-time notifications. They expect state-of-the-art equipment to be used, and often they have a stated preference for open path technologies due to the perception that comprehensive fence line coverage is better than just monitoring the points along a fence line. And lastly, when you're dealing with a complex, multifaceted fence line monitoring program like that, you really need to have an experienced team with a variety of different skills to be successful. So that is the end of my presentation. I wasn't sure how long this was supposed to be. I kind of designed it with 25 minutes in mind, and then saw like, oh, this is actually 45 minutes. So we have quite a bit of time left here. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or help facilitate a discussion. We have a lot of people in the room. I recognize a lot of people here, so I open the floor.
You made a distinction about the federal requirements, and then you talked about like household and the district requirements. How is any of this showing up in the Title V permit? Are there? So that's the first question. Because the second part is, I think Title V can't be in place for EJ communities. Like go into. Have you seen any of that, or are you hearing anything like that along that line of?
That's a good question. I really don't have a good answer for it though, but I'd like to open it up in case someone else in the room does know whether or not any of those things have actually entered into the Title V permits for facilities.
The benzene Fenceline stuff is all in.
Okay.
Title V permits, so that will follow the line application stuff.
Did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So when we were talking about how the EJCP is getting harder, what you foresee or what you guys are, I didn't know Colorado for these. Basic jokes.
Yeah, where it's going, there is a suspicion in Colorado that, you know, they've asked for 3 compounds, right? They've asked for hydrogen cyanide, benzene, and H2S. Well, probably not coincidentally, there's no one measurement technology that does all 3 of those things well. It really requires 3 different technologies. Okay, well then once you get those 3 technologies out there, and in particular 2 of them, UV-DOS and FTIR, are capable of measuring a significant number of compounds. FTIR in particular can measure hundreds. Well, once it's out there, and the law says we may add things later, they want you to put in that plan for Colorado. Well, list the other things that the technology is capable of measuring. So it's quite conceivable that the target compound list for that Colorado program is going to balloon.
On the Colorado program, BHIR, is that a point source or is that, are they using some sort of Fenceline application?
It'll be an open pass, so long.
It's part of the open path.
Yeah. So the stated preference of the Colorado law, it doesn't mandate it, and I had the language earlier, but it calls for optical remote sensing, which is basically open path technology, or it says, or equivalent technology that can provide adequate temporal and spatial resolution. Interpret that how you will.
First question, are you familiar with the threshold of Colorado? They didn't.
They have not provided numbers. What they do say in the law, and it appears multiple times, the word acute, that, you know, that the notification thresholds are supposed to be based on acute health risks. Chronic does not appear anywhere in the law. So the thought is that they may use Eagles as the threshold levels, but that's something I think that the division is still trying to work out. And so in the case of benzene and hydrogen cyanide, I don't think that's going to affect the choice of technology, because I think FTIR and UV-DOS is able to provide sufficient detection limits for each of those compounds respectively. H2S, though, is kind of the wild card, because the AGL for H2S is an hourly averages, I think 510 parts per billion, which is pushing it if you're talking about measuring H2S by FTIR.
Secondly, is maybe a comment. We all know about the Fenceline rule, the 325 for benzene. There's talk for expand the list of compounds. Canadian now expanded to 6 compounds. And I think also in the United States, they are thinking about expanding it. And the method also calls for alternative work practice. So there's a possibility to use an open path instrument instead of the passive sorbent tube, or as a supplement for that.
Yeah.
And if there are people from the industry, I think it's a good way to go. Before that, the obstacle was detection limit, but I think we can go through it.
Well, maybe our next speaker will be addressing that.
The next speaker will talk about ethylene oxide.
Okay.
Maybe the next one.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not, you know, so the benzene refinery will allow for the use of alternative technologies, you know, I'm not aware of anyone that actually ended up using an alternative technology as opposed to the passive sampling tubes. I am aware of facilities that supplemented their fenceline monitoring plan using real-time monitoring techniques to account for the contribution of near field and offsite sources. But
I saw a car regulation applied to bulk terminals too, which is interesting. Is that, do you happen to know if like the regulations for refinery and the bulk terminal are they the same? They expecting the same like open path system to be installed both?
yes, so the only difference is the timeline for implementation, whereas the refinery has to be active on January 1st, 2023. The bulk terminals have an extra year, so January 1st, 2024.
Fascinating. Fine products.
And it's also interesting the way that, you know, if you follow the evolution of the law, initially it was, they just looked at facilities that had certain emission thresholds. So if you emitted hydrogen cyanide benzene or, you know, up at an annual rate above a certain threshold, you were in. Well, one of the terminal facilities that would have been in went back and revised their TRI to try and get under, which I think raised the ire of the people who came up with the rule. And so they changed it. Okay, well, it's no longer based on emission thresholds. It's based on industry codes. And we don't care. As long as you emit greater than 0, now you're in. But there are terminal facilities that aren't subject to this because their industry code isn't as a bulk terminal, it's as a pipeline facility. So this is not over.
And I believe it's just a non-contained area.
Yeah, but that's only for one of the 3 codes. I think that's just for the terminal code. So the petroleum refinery, there's no distinction there. Aircraft parts manufacturing, no distinction. And then the terminals have this weird thing if you are within the 8-hour non-attainment area.
Oh,
But the terminals are measuring are required to monitor HCN. Think about it.
And that doesn't make sense.
Well, measuring HCN, you know, your HCN emissions are not fugitive emissions, right? And fenceline monitoring programs are really designed for measurement of fugitive emissions. So how should I put this? The people coming up with these rules, it's a different order of things now, right? So, and if you read about news articles about what's happening in Colorado, and anytime HCN is referenced by the community groups out there, they never fail to mention the fact that that's the gas that the Nazis used in the concentration camps. So,
If you were to speculate initial costs for the one system,
that's a complex question.
let's say 4 stations.
I can tell you that our devices are great value. But there is a lot of infrastructure that's involved with an open path fenceline monitoring program. And so the ultimate cost is really going to be dependent upon, do you have power available in areas? Do you have open line of sight? Do you, you know, how tall do you need to put your shelter to get open line of sight? And so
10 meters.
The infrastructure is every bit as expensive as.
more.
So it's not about just the analyzer list. It's about design, thoughtfulness.
We're talking about $1 million, $2 million. Sure.
you're probably looking at half to $1 million per node. To have 1 or 2 paths starting.
So for some of the smaller facilities that are subject to the Colorado rule, it's,
Mind you, I'm basing off of the projects in California, which had all these special permits, all the seismic, all this stuff that added on. I do not know.
all right, well, thank you, everyone.